The conference room on the 42nd floor of Haverson Industries smelled of bergamot cologne and old money, the kind of scent that clung to mahogany paneling and whispered that certain people belonged here and certain people did not. Crystal pitchers caught the late morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city sprawling beneath them like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. 12 executives sat arranged along the polished walnut table, their leather portfolios closed, their pens uncapped, their attention fixed on the woman who had just finished her presentation with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of someone who had rehearsed every word 100 times. Dr. Imani Calloway stood at the head of the room with her hands folded in front of her charcoal blazer impeccably tailored, her posture betraying nothing of the storm she had walked into. She had spent 47 minutes laying out a restructuring proposal that could save Haverson Industries from the slow bleed of a failing portfolio, a plan built on years of quiet research and the kind of insight that only came from watching empires rise and fall from the outside. She had spoken with clarity. She had answered every question with data. She had been everything they had asked her to be, and still, she could feel it in the room. The way they watched her without really seeing her, the way their eyes flickered to one another instead of to her slides, the way the laughter that should have come at her opening joke had landed instead like a stone dropped into still water. At the center of the table sat Margaret Haverson Pierce, 63 years old, draped in a cream silk suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her blonde hair was swept back in a severe twist, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she tilted her head, and her lips were painted the precise shade of red that women of her station wore when they wanted to be remembered. She was the majority shareholder, the granddaughter of the founder, the woman whose family name was etched into the bronze plaque downstairs, and she had not said a single word during the entire presentation. When Imani finished, when she finally closed her laptop and took a breath, she walked the length of that long table with measured steps. Her heels made no sound against the thick carpet. She stopped beside Margaret's chair, extended her right hand across the polished wood, and offered the gesture that had opened 10,000 doors in her career. A handshake, professional, expected. The universal language of business agreements that transcended every other difference between two people in a room. Margaret looked at the hand. Then she looked at Imani's face. Then she let out a laugh so sharp and bright it could have cut glass. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice dripping with the kind of honey that masked something rotten underneath. "Who let her in?" The room cracked open like an egg. 3 of the men nearest Margaret broke into immediate laughter, the loud, performative kind that men use when they want a powerful woman to know they are on her side. A younger executive at the far end of the table covered his mouth with his palm and snickered into it. Another, a balding man in his 50s with a wedding ring he had clearly grown too comfortable with, threw his head back and chuckled openly. The sound spread down the table like a contagion, and within seconds, 8 of the 12 executives were laughing along with Margaret, as if the joke had been the funniest thing they had heard all quarter. Imani's hand remained extended. Her arm did not waver. Her expression did not shift. She had been here before in different rooms with different people, wearing different versions of the same humiliation. She knew this moment. She had been preparing for it her entire adult life. Margaret leaned back in her chair, dabbing at the corner of her eye with one manicured finger as though she had laughed so hard she might cry. I'm sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "It's just," she gestured vaguely at Imani, at her presentation slides still glowing on the screen behind her, at the entire situation. "Did someone actually invite you to present, or did you just wander in off the street? Because I have to say, the audacity is impressive." A few more chuckles rippled around the table. Daniel Voss, the chief operating officer, leaned toward Margaret and murmured something that made her grin widen. "Honestly, darling," Margaret continued, finally turning her face fully toward Imani, "I don't know what consulting firm sent you, but I'd ask for a refund. We don't really do handshakes with—" She paused, searching for a word that would land just softly enough to be deniable, "with newcomers. Not until we know who they are. And I'm afraid I don't know you at all." Imani let her hand hover one more second, just one, long enough for everyone at the table to see it, long enough for the cameras in the corners of the room, the ones Margaret had forgotten were there, to record every detail of what was happening. Then she withdrew her hand slowly, deliberately, and placed it at her side. She smiled. It was a small smile, a polite smile. The kind of smile that belonged to a woman who had just been handed a gift and was waiting for the right moment to open it. "Of course," Imani said softly. "My apologies for the assumption." What none of them knew, what Margaret in her cream silk suit and her diamond earrings could not possibly have imagined as she basked in the warmth of her own cruelty, was that the woman standing in front of her owned $1 billion of the very company Margaret thought she controlled. And in exactly 48 hours, every single person laughing at that table was going to learn her name. Imani walked back to the head of the table with the same measured steps, the same silence in her heels, the same quiet that had carried her through every hostile room of her career. She did not gather her materials in a rush. She did not flush or stammer or apologize again. She simply turned, faced the room one more time, and let her eyes move across each executive seated at that long mahogany table, one by one, as though committing their faces to a ledger only she could see. Daniel Voss looked away first. He suddenly found his cuff link fascinating, twisting it between his thumb and forefinger as though the brass had personally offended him. 2 seats down, a woman named Catherine Mills, the only other female executive in the room aside from Margaret, stared down at her notepad and pretended to write something. Imani recognized that posture, the posture of complicity wearing the costume of discomfort, the posture of someone who knew exactly what had just happened and would never, ever speak of it out loud. A coward in a tailored blouse. "Thank you for your time," Imani said, her voice as steady as it had been at the beginning of the presentation. "I'll see myself out." "Oh, no need to take it so personally," Margaret called after her, voice still threaded with amusement. "We just don't really know what to do with you. Maybe leave your card with reception. If we have something more suitable, we'll be in touch." A few more chuckles. Someone coughed to disguise a laugh. Imani did not turn around. She picked up her laptop, slid it into her leather portfolio, and walked toward the heavy double doors at the far end of the room. Every step felt longer than the one before it, not because she was hurting, not because she was breaking, but because she was counting the seconds, counting the faces, counting the moves still left on the board. Her father's voice surfaced from somewhere deep in her memory as she crossed the threshold into the hallway. He had been a janitor at a courthouse for 31 years before he retired, a man who had cleaned the floors of judges who would never know his name. He used to sit her down at their kitchen table when she was 9 years old and tell her, "Baby girl, when somebody shows you they don't see you, don't waste your breath trying to make them look. Just remember who you are. The world has a way of opening eyes when the time is right." She had carried those words through Stanford, through Harvard Business School, through the doctorate she had earned at MIT while working 2 jobs to pay for it. She had carried them through 12 years of being the only black woman in boardrooms across 3 continents, through being mistaken for the assistant, the caterer, the wrong person in the wrong room more times than she could count. She had carried them all the way to the moment, 6 years ago, when she had quietly founded Meridian Holdings with 3 other partners and begun the slow, methodical work of accumulating positions in companies that did not yet know they would one day need her. Haverson Industries had been one of those companies. She had been buying its stock through layered subsidiaries for the last 4 years. She had purchased the distressed debt of 2 of its largest subsidiaries through an offshore trust last spring. She had spent 18 months building relationships with the pension funds and institutional investors who held the rest of the leverage. And just 3 weeks ago, in a transaction that had been buried in regulatory filings most analysts never bothered to read, she had finalized the acquisition that pushed her total controlling interest in Haverson Industries to $1 billion exactly, 37% of the entire company, the single largest position any individual shareholder had ever held in the firm's 80-year history. Margaret Haverson Pierce, with her cream silk suit and her diamond earrings and her laughter that cut like glass, was not actually the majority owner of the company her grandfather had built. She just thought she was. She held 26% through her family trust. The board had been told for years that no single outside party had accumulated enough shares to challenge her position because the people advising her had not done their homework. They had assumed. They had relaxed. They had laughed at handshakes from women they did not bother to recognize. Imani reached the elevator bank, pressed the down button, and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. The polished steel doors reflected a woman in a charcoal blazer with not a single hair out of place. A woman whose face revealed nothing of the calculation happening behind her eyes. A woman who had just been handed, on a silver platter, the exact evidence she needed to do what she had been planning to do for nearly half a decade. Because she had not come to Haverson Industries today to sell them a restructuring proposal. She had come to test them, to see, with her own eyes, what kind of leadership she would be inheriting. To see whether the rumors she had been hearing for years about Margaret's casual cruelty, about the toxic culture she had cultivated, about the discrimination lawsuits that had been quietly settled and tucked into non-disclosure agreements, were true. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Imani stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched her own reflection as the doors closed. She allowed herself, for just one moment, the smallest of smiles. Not a smile of triumph, not yet. A smile of confirmation. They had told her exactly who they were. Now she was going to show them exactly who she was. And in 48 hours, the woman who had laughed at her handshake was going to find out that the company she thought she owned had a new majority stakeholder. One who was not in the mood to forget anything that had been said in that room. The lobby of Haverson Industries was an exercise in calculated intimidation. 20-foot ceilings, a fountain that cascaded down a wall of black granite, an enormous bronze sculpture of the company's founder, Cornelius Haverson, standing with his hand resting on a globe as though he had personally placed the continents where they belonged. Imani crossed the marble floor without glancing at any of it. She had seen lobbies like this before in dozens of cities, and she had learned a long time ago that the grander the entrance, the more fragile the empire behind it. A black town car was waiting for her at the curb. The driver, a soft-spoken man named Eugene who had worked for her for nearly a decade, opened the rear door without a word. He had seen her come out of meetings like this before. He knew the look on her face, the unnatural calm. The way she would slide into the back seat and not speak for the first 5 minutes. "Where to, Dr. Calloway?" he asked gently after the silence had stretched long enough. "The office, Eugene, and take the long way. I need to think." The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the slow afternoon traffic. Imani pulled out her phone, a sleek black device that held the kind of contacts most people did not know existed, and tapped a single name. The line connected on the second ring. "It's done," she said. The voice on the other end belonged to Sterling Whittaker, her general counsel and one of the 4 people in the world who knew the full scope of what she had built. Sterling had been with her since the founding of Meridian Holdings. He was 61 years old, a Howard Law graduate, the son of a Tuskegee airman, and one of the sharpest legal minds in mergers and acquisitions on the East Coast. He spoke now with the calm of a man who had been waiting for this call for months. "How bad?" "Worse than the reports suggested," Imani said. She refused the handshake. In front of the entire executive team, she made a joke about who let me in. The room laughed. There was a pause. Imani could hear Sterling exhale slowly through his nose the way he always did when he was processing something he had hoped not to hear. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sterling. I'm better than fine." She gave us everything we needed and then some. Cameras in the room. At least 8 executives laughing on record. 2 who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I want every name. I want every face matched to every employment contract, every stock option package, every personal financial entanglement they have with the company. Pull Catherine Mills's file separately. She didn't laugh, but she didn't speak either. I want to understand her. Already on it. The team has been pulling threads since you walked in this morning. We've got the regulatory filings on the final tranche of shares scheduled to clear at 9 a.m. Wednesday. Once those settle, the public disclosure goes out at 10. Good. I want the board to find out from the wire, not from a phone call. I want Margaret to read it on her tablet during her morning coffee. I want her to choke on it. Understood. There was another pause. Imani. You know that once we pull the trigger, this becomes a war. She has friends. The Haverson family has been in this city for 4 generations. Senators, judges, charity boards. She will not go quietly. Sterling, she already went loudly. I just gave her enough rope to keep going. Let her fight. Let her bring everyone she has. I want every one of them on the record before the end of the month. And the executives in the room today. Imani looked out the tinted window of the town car, watching the city slide past. A woman pushing a stroller across a crosswalk. A construction worker eating a sandwich on a bench. An old man feeding pigeons. The world doing what the world did, indifferent to the small rooms where small people made decisions that affected millions of lives. I want a full audit of every diversity complaint that has been settled and sealed in the last 15 years. I want the names of the people who signed those non-disclosure agreements. Approach them through counsel carefully. Tell them that a change is coming. Tell them that if they are willing to speak, there will be protection and there will be resources. No pressure. No promises that cannot be kept, just an open door. Imani. Yes. This is going to get ugly before it gets clean. It already was ugly, Sterling. We're just turning the lights on. She ended the call and set the phone face down on the leather seat beside her. Outside, the buildings began to thin as the car turned onto the quieter avenue that led toward Meridian's offices. She let her head rest back against the seat and closed her eyes for the first time all day. She thought of her mother, who had worked as a hospital cleaner for 34 years and who had died 3 days after Imani had graduated from Harvard, never living to see what her daughter would build. She thought of the moment her mother had pressed an envelope into her hand the week before the funeral, an envelope containing the $17,000 she had quietly saved over the decades, dollar by dollar, from a job that paid $11 an hour. She thought of what her mother had whispered to her in the hospital bed. Baby, build something they can't take away, and when they try, you let them try. Imani opened her eyes. The car was pulling into the underground parking garage of the Meridian building. The doors of the elevator slid open before her, and she stepped inside, and she pressed the button for the 38th floor. The clock was already ticking. The 38th floor of the Meridian building was nothing like the floors of Haverson Industries. There was no marble. There were no fountains. There were no bronze statues of long-dead patriarchs guarding the entrance. Instead, there was a quiet, warm space with reclaimed oak floors, walls lined with photographs of the communities Meridian had invested in over the years, and a reception desk staffed by a young woman named Renee who looked up with a genuine smile when Imani walked through the glass doors. Welcome back, Dr. Calloway. Mr. Whitaker is already in the war room. The rest of the team is assembled. Thank you, Renee. Imani walked down the long corridor toward the conference room they had nicknamed the War Room 3 years ago, back when they had been planning their first major activist position. The walls of the corridor were lined with framed black and white photographs of the neighborhoods Meridian had funded. A community health clinic in West Baltimore, a vocational training center in East St. Louis, a child care cooperative in the Mississippi Delta, a small business incubator on the south side of Chicago. These were not vanity projects. These were the reason Meridian existed. Every dollar the firm made was a dollar that flowed eventually into communities that the Margaret Haverson Pierces of the world had spent generations writing off. The war room was already humming when Imani pushed open the door. Sterling Whitaker stood at the head of the long table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. To his left sat Devin Ashford, Meridian's chief financial officer, a former Goldman Sachs analyst who had walked away from a 7-figure bonus 6 years ago because, as he put it at the time, he was tired of making rich people richer. To Sterling's right sat Yolanda Briggs, the firm's head of communications and a former senior producer at a major cable news network, A woman with a Rolodex that could move markets if she chose to dial the right numbers in the right order. And at the far end of the table sat a woman Imani had only met twice in person but had been corresponding with for nearly 2 years. Beatrice Okonkwo, a forensic accountant who had spent 11 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission before going into private practice, and who had been quietly building a parallel file on Handshake Industries for the past 6 months under a contract so airtight that only 3 people in the firm even knew it existed. "Talk to me," Imani said as she took her seat at the table and accepted the cup of black coffee Riene set in front of her without being asked. Devon went first. The final tranche clears at 9 on Wednesday morning. We're at 36.8% right now. The last batch pushes us to 37.1. Margaret's family trust controls 26%. The next largest single holder is a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund at 9%. The rest is distributed among institutional investors, the employee stock plan, and retail. We've already had quiet conversations with the Norwegians. They are not aligned with Margaret. They will vote with us in a proxy fight if it comes to that. "It will come to that," Imani said. "Agreed. The pension funds we've been courting represent another 14% collectively. 3 of the 4 boards have signaled they are willing to consider a leadership change at Handshake if presented with sufficient cause. The 4th is still on the fence, but the chair of that board is a woman named Loretta Greaves, and she went to Spelman with your cousin Adrian. Adrian has offered to make an introduction." Imani nodded. "Set it up for Thursday." Sterling took over. "On the legal front, we have everything in order for a Wednesday filing. The 13D goes out at 10 a.m. The accompanying letter to the board lays out our intentions clearly. We are not coming in as passive investors. We are demanding 3 board seats, a forensic audit of the last 15 years of human resources settlements, and the resignation of Margaret Haverson Pierce as chair within 90 days. We are also requesting an independent investigation into the toxic culture allegations." "What does her resignation clause look like?" "Clean. We are not asking for clawbacks. Not yet. We let her walk with her dignity intact publicly, and the moment she resigns, the investigation begins. If she refuses to step down, we go to the wire with the cameras." Yolanda leaned forward. "About the cameras, I need to be careful here. The footage from this morning is, frankly, devastating. If we release it on day 1, we look like we engineered a trap. If we hold it back and Margaret tries to spin the narrative, we look like we were hiding evidence. My recommendation is that we do not release it ourselves. We let someone else discover it. There are 3 reporters I can call, all of whom have a history of breaking corporate culture stories. We tip them to the existence of the footage. They request it through legitimate channels. The story tells itself. How long does that take? 48 to 72 hours after the 13D drops. The 13D itself is the earthquake. The video is the aftershock." Beatrice cleared her throat for the first time. She was a small woman, mid-50s, hair pulled back in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses, and a stillness about her that reminded Imani of a hawk on a fence post. When she spoke, the room listened. "I want to add something. In the course of my audit, I have found 3 transactions that I cannot explain through ordinary business activity. They are not enormous numbers individually. The largest is $4.2 million. But the pattern is consistent, the counterparties are opaque, and the routing through 3 offshore vehicles in the Caymans and Liechtenstein is the kind of structure I used to chase at the commission. I'm not yet ready to call it fraud. I am ready to call it interesting, and I would like another 2 weeks to follow it before we go public." The room was quiet for a moment. Imani set down her coffee. 2 weeks is what you have, Beatrice. Bring me everything." The next 48 hours passed with the strange quiet that always preceded the storms Imani had learned to summon. Tuesday came and went in a blur of phone calls placed through secure lines, documents reviewed in triplicate, and last-minute confirmations from coalition partners whose support had been months in the making. Imani slept 4 hours on Tuesday night, woke at 4 in the morning, and went for a long run along the river while the city was still dark. By the time the sun rose, she had already eaten breakfast, reviewed the final press release one last time, and put on the navy blue suit she had chosen specifically for the day. Navy, because black would have looked like mourning and red would have looked like war, and she wanted something in between, something that said she had arrived to do business. At 8:45 Wednesday morning, Margaret Haverson Pierce was in her townhouse on the Upper East Side, drinking her second cup of espresso and reviewing the agenda for the executive committee meeting she would chair at 10. She wore a peach-colored cashmere robe over silk pajamas, her blonde hair was wrapped in a silk scarf, and she was scrolling through the financial news on her tablet when she paused. She scrolled back up. She read the same headline twice. Meridian HOLDINGS DISCLOSES 37.1% activist stake in HALVRSON INDUSTRAS. DEMANDS leadership overhaul. Margaret stared at the screen. She blinked. She read it a third time. Then she set down her espresso cup with such force that the saucer cracked beneath it, and a thin brown line of liquid bled across the white marble of her kitchen counter. She did not know the name Meridian Holdings. She had never heard of a firm by that name. She tapped the headline with a manicured finger and opened the article, and as she read, the blood drained from her face in slow, deliberate increments. $1 billion, 37% of her family's company, a demand for her resignation as chair, an independent investigation into the company's culture, 3 board seats, a forensic audit of 15 years of human resources settlements. Her hand was shaking when she picked up her phone. She dialed Daniel Voss. He picked up on the first ring and his voice told her he had already seen it. "Margaret, I just got the alert. I'm reading it now." "Who is this woman? Who is Imani Calloway? I have never heard this name in my life." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a pause so long that Margaret pulled the phone away from her ear and looked at the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. "Daniel, who is she?" "Margaret." His voice had gone very soft. "She was in our conference room on Monday." Margaret was silent. Her mind raced backward through the week, through the faces and meetings and presentations that filled her days the way water filled a glass. She could not place a face to the name. She did not remember an Imani Calloway. And then, slowly, with the awful clarity of a memory surfacing from the bottom of a deep pool, she remembered the woman in the charcoal blazer. The one who had presented something about restructuring, the one she had laughed at, the one whose handshake she had refused, the one to whom she had said in front of 12 witnesses and at least 2 cameras she had forgotten about who let her in. "Oh," Margaret whispered, and then because she did not have any other words available to her, she said it again. "Oh, Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to the press. Do not send any emails. Do not text anyone about this. Get dressed and get to the office. I am calling Bradford and Hayes right now to assemble outside counsel. We are convening an emergency meeting at 11. She was sitting right there. She was at our table. She was. Margaret's voice cracked on the next word and she could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Daniel Voss had been in the room. He had been one of the men who laughed loudest. "I know, Margaret, I know. Just get to the office. We will figure this out." The call ended. Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long moment, staring at the cracked saucer and the brown smear of espresso across the white marble. Then she set down the phone, stood up slowly, and went upstairs to get dressed. She moved like a woman who had just been told someone had died. She did not yet understand that the person who had died was the version of herself she had spent her entire life believing in. The version that was untouchable. The version that could laugh at a handshake from a stranger and never have to think about it again. Across the city, on the 38th floor of the Meridian building, Imani Calloway sat at the head of her conference table and watched the financial news roll in real time. The phones at Meridian had been ringing since 2 minutes after 10. Reporters, analysts, other activist investors offering to coordinate. 3 different members of the Haverson board, including one who was already trying to negotiate the terms of his own survival before the meeting had even been called. Imani let every one of those calls go to voicemail, every single one. There would be time for conversations later, when the rules of the conversation had been rewritten. Yolanda walked into the room with her phone pressed to her ear, ended the call, and turned to Imani with the smallest of smiles. "The footage just leaked. It's already on 3 networks. By noon, it will be on every screen in the country. The video spread the way only a particular kind of video can spread in the modern world. By 11:30, it was the top story on every business network. By noon, it had crossed over from financial coverage to general news. By 1 in the afternoon, it was trending on every social media platform, and the clip had been viewed 11 million times. The footage was crisp and unforgiving. The cameras in the corners of the Haverson conference room had captured everything in high definition with synchronized audio. Margaret's laugh, the words who let her in, the men chuckling along the table. The way Imani's hand had remained extended, the way she had withdrawn it slowly, the way she had smiled that small, polite smile that now read, in the context of what the world had learned about her, as the most devastating smile any executive had given in a boardroom in years. The networks played the clip on a loop. Cable anchors brought on panels of corporate governance experts who used phrases like cultural reckoning and historic moment, and the kind of accountability we have been waiting for. A retired federal judge appeared on a morning show and said, with the slow certainty of someone who had seen many empires fall, that Margaret Haverson Pierce had just done more damage to her family's legacy in 6 seconds than her grandfather had built in 60 years. A young columnist at one of the major papers wrote a piece titled simply "The Handshake That Cost $1 billion," and by Wednesday evening, the piece had been shared so many times the newspaper's servers briefly went down. Margaret arrived at Haverson Industries through the underground parking garage at 10:45. She had not been able to use the front entrance because there were already reporters camped on the sidewalk. She rode the executive elevator up to the 42nd floor with Daniel Voss beside her and a security guard she did not recognize standing behind her, and when the doors opened on her floor, she walked past her own assistant without looking at her, into her office, and shut the door. Her phone had 87 missed calls. Her email inbox had more than 400 unread messages. Her assistant had stopped trying to keep up sometime around 10:15. Margaret sat down behind her desk, which was carved from a single slab of imported Italian walnut, and she stared at the wall across from her. On that wall hung an oil painting of her grandfather Cornelius, the same man whose bronze likeness stood in the lobby downstairs. He had been painted at 63 years old, the same age Margaret was now, his hand resting on a leather-bound ledger, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that suggested he was looking at the future of his company. Margaret had grown up believing that the future of the company was hers, that it would always be hers, that no force in the world could come and take it from her, because the rules of the world had been written by men like her grandfather for women like her. She picked up the phone and called her personal attorney, a man named Bradford Whitcomb III, who had represented the Haverson family for 19 years. "Bradford, tell me what we do." There was a pause on the other end of the line that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life, a pause that contained in its slow unfolding the full weight of what she had not yet allowed herself to understand. "Margaret, I have to be honest with you. I have spent the last hour on the phone with 3 of the country's top defense firms. The strongest opinion I am getting back is that you should resign as chair voluntarily within 24 hours, issue a personal apology, and cooperate fully with the investigation. The footage is too clean. The 13D is too well prepared. Meridian has been building this position for years, and they have been doing it carefully. There is no procedural opening to challenge their stake. There is no defense against what is on that video. Bradford, Margaret, I am telling you what I know. The board will move against you by Friday whether you resign or not. 3 members called me before I called you. 2 of them have already retained their own counsel. They are looking at the personal exposure they may face from the human resources settlements that are about to come into the light. They are not going to fall on a sword for you. They are going to put the sword in your hand and ask you to use it on yourself." Margaret was silent for a long time. She looked at the painting of her grandfather. She thought about the fact that he had built this company with the help of 17 black laborers in the 1940s whose names had been scrubbed from the official history of the firm, a history her own father had commissioned a friendly historian to write in the 1980s. She had known about those men in a vague way for most of her adult life. She had never thought about them. They had been a footnote in a story that belonged to her family. Bradford, what does she want? Who? The woman, Calloway, what does she actually want from me? There was another pause, this one shorter. Margaret, I do not think she wants anything from you. I think she has already taken it. I think the question is what you are willing to give up to keep what is left. Margaret hung up the phone without answering. She sat at her desk for a long time. She watched the afternoon light shift across the painting of her grandfather. And for the first time in many, many years, Margaret Haverson Pierce understood that the world she had been living in was not the world that actually existed. The world that actually existed had been waiting, patiently, with a charcoal blazer and an extended hand, for exactly this moment. She picked up her pen, opened a fresh page in her leather notebook, and began to write her resignation letter. She had not finished the first sentence when her assistant knocked on the door. "Mrs. Haverson Pierce, there is someone here to see you. She does not have an appointment, but she said you would want to see her." Margaret looked up slowly. "Who is it?" "Her name is Dr. Imani Calloway." Margaret set down her pen very slowly. She closed the leather notebook. She straightened the cuffs of her ivory silk blouse, the one she had chosen that morning before any of this had begun, back when she had still believed that the day belonged to her. She looked at her assistant, a young woman named Hannah who had worked for her for 4 years and who was now standing in the doorway with an expression Margaret had never seen on her face before. Not fear, not pity, something quieter than both. Something that looked, if Margaret was honest with herself, almost like relief. "Send her in." Hannah nodded and stepped back into the hallway. Margaret stood up from her desk and walked to the window, partly to compose herself and partly because she did not want to be sitting when Imani Calloway entered the room. She did not want to look up at the woman she had refused to look at 3 days ago. She wanted to stand. She wanted, in whatever way still remained available to her, to meet this moment on her feet. The door opened. Imani walked in alone. No lawyers, no assistants, no entourage. She wore the same navy suit she had worn for the press appearances earlier that morning, and she carried nothing in her hands except a single manila folder. She closed the door behind her with a quiet click and stood just inside the threshold, waiting. Margaret turned from the window. The two women looked at each other across the length of the office, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The afternoon light fell across the carpet between them in a pale gold band. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. "Dr. Calloway," Margaret said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected it to be. "Mrs. Haverson Pierce, please sit." Imani did not move. "I'll stand. This won't take long." Margaret nodded. She did not sit either. She gestured slightly with one hand, an open palm, an invitation to begin. Imani opened the manila folder and set it on the edge of Margaret's desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Margaret stepped forward slowly and looked down at it. It was not a legal document. It was not a press release. It was a list. A list of 17 names, typed in a clean serif font, with dates beside each one ranging from 1944 to 1962. Margaret stared at the list. She knew these names. Or rather, she did not know them, but she knew what they were. They were the men her grandfather had erased. "Where did you get this?" "Their families gave it to me. 3 years ago I started looking for them. It took some time. Most of the records were never kept properly. Some of the families had moved away from the city. Some had passed the story down and some had not. But I found them, all 17. I have spent the last 3 years funding scholarships for their descendants. There are 31 young people in college right now whose great-grandfathers built the warehouses that became this company. I doubt you have ever heard a single one of their names." Margaret did not look up from the list. Her fingers moved toward it but did not quite touch it. "I am not here for an apology," Imani said. Her voice was calm, not cold, just calm. "I am not here to humiliate you further. I am not here to gloat. I want you to understand something, and I want you to understand it clearly, because the rest of your life is going to be shaped by whether you understand it or not." Margaret raised her eyes. On Monday, when you laughed at me, you were not laughing at a stranger. You were laughing at every woman who has ever walked into a room like this and been told she did not belong. You were laughing at my mother, who cleaned hospitals for 34 years. You were laughing at the 17 men on that list. You were laughing at the version of yourself you could have been if anyone in your life had ever taught you to see people instead of categories. I'm not the cause of what happened to you this week. I am the consequence. The office was very quiet. Margaret felt something rise in her throat that she did not have a word for. It was not grief exactly. It was not shame exactly. It was something older than both, something that had been waiting underneath her entire life, something she had spent 63 years not feeling. "I am going to resign," she said. The words came out smaller than she had intended. "I know. I was writing the letter when you came in." "I know that too." Margaret looked at Imani, really looked at her. For the first time, perhaps in her entire life, she looked at another human being without the filter of where they fit in the hierarchy she had inherited from her grandfather. She saw a woman. She saw intelligence and discipline and a kind of grace that Margaret recognized, with a sudden lurching clarity that she had never possessed herself. "What do you want from me, Dr. Calloway?" "I want you to do 3 things. I want you to resign by tomorrow morning. I want you to cooperate fully with the investigation that is about to begin into the settlements that have been buried under non-disclosure agreements for the last 15 years. And I want you, personally, to fund the renaming of the lobby downstairs. The bronze statue of your grandfather will remain, but the plaque beside it will list all 18 names of the people who built this company, including yours if you want it, but it will not be alone anymore." Margaret was quiet for a long time. She looked down at the list of 17 names on her desk. She thought about her grandfather, painted at 63 with his hand on a ledger, looking at a future he had built by erasing the people who had built it with him. "Yes," she said finally, "I will do all 3. Imani nodded once. She did not smile. She did not extend her hand. She simply turned, opened the door, and walked out of the office. Margaret stood alone in the silence she had spent her whole life avoiding. After a long time, she sat down at her desk, opened the leather notebook again, and began to write. Margaret Haverson Pierce's resignation letter went out at 6 o'clock the next morning. It was 3 paragraphs long. It did not blame anyone. It did not minimize what had happened. It used the word ashamed once and the word sorry twice, and it announced that she would be personally funding an endowment in the names of the 17 men who had built the original Haverson warehouses in the 1940s. The letter was, by the standards of corporate resignations, almost shockingly direct. It read like something written by a person, not by a public relations firm. Which it was, because Margaret had refused, against Bradford Whitcomb's strenuous advice, to let anyone draft it for her. The financial press did not quite know what to do with the letter. They had been expecting a fight. They had been expecting deflection, lawyers, leaked counter-narratives. They had not been expecting an actual resignation written in actual English by a woman who appeared to have, at least in some small measure, understood what she had done. The story shifted within hours. By Thursday afternoon, the dominant narrative was no longer about Margaret's fall but about what would happen next, and the cameras turned, as cameras always do, toward Imani. She gave one interview that week. Only one. To a journalist named Adiz Anyuoha, who had spent 20 years writing about corporate accountability and who had been the first reporter Yolanda had called when the footage was ready to be discovered. The interview took place in the Meridian War Room on Friday afternoon. It lasted 90 minutes. It was published the following Tuesday, and within 48 hours, it had been read more than 14 million times. The interview did not focus on Margaret. Imani had refused, gently but firmly, to spend the conversation talking about a woman who had already lost. Instead, she talked about the 17 names. She talked about her mother and the $17,000 in the envelope. She talked about her father and the courthouse floors. She talked about Meridian, about the communities the firm had been quietly funding for 6 years, about the difference between performative diversity and structural change, about the way American capitalism had been built on extraction, and what it would take to begin building something else. She talked, in the part of the interview that would later be quoted in business school case studies for years, about why she had chosen to walk into the Haverson conference room herself instead of sending a subordinate. "I needed to know who I was inheriting," she said. "I needed to see them, not their press releases, not their carefully curated annual reports, them, because once I owned the building, I was going to be responsible for everyone in it. The people who had been hurt by the old leadership were going to be looking at me to make it right, and I could not make it right if I did not know exactly what right meant in that specific room. So I went. I presented a real proposal. The proposal was good. If they had treated me like a human being, if they had taken the presentation seriously, if any one of them had stood up and said, 'Wait, this is interesting, we should listen,' then everything that has happened this week would have happened differently. They told me who they were, and I believed them." Adiz had asked her, near the end of the interview, whether she felt vindicated. Imani had been quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Vindication is a small word for what I feel. I feel responsible. There are 11,000 employees at Haverson Industries. Most of them have never met Margaret Haverson Pierce. Most of them have been doing the actual work of the company for years, often underpaid, often under-recognized, often watching people who looked nothing like them get promoted over them. Those 11,000 people are now my responsibility. The communities where Haverson operates are my responsibility. The pension funds that hold positions in this company on behalf of teachers and firefighters and factory workers are my responsibility. I do not have time to feel vindicated. I have work to do." The interview ended there. It became the most discussed business profile of the year. 3 weeks after Margaret's resignation, the new board took its seats. Imani had not taken the chair herself. She had instead nominated a 71-year-old woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance, a former dean of the Wharton School and one of the most respected corporate governance experts in the country, who had agreed to serve for 3 years on the condition that the work of structural reform actually be done. The board now included 2 of Imani's nominees, 2 holdovers from the previous board who had been cleared by the independent investigation, and 4 new members drawn from a slate that Yolanda had spent weeks vetting. Of the 9 seats, 5 were now held by women. 4 were held by people of color. The makeup of the room had been transformed completely, and the change had been accomplished through ownership, not through pleading. The forensic audit Patris Okonkwo had been running quietly for months produced its first findings 6 weeks after the takeover. The 3 transactions she had flagged turned out to be the tip of a much larger iceberg. Over the course of 14 years, more than $19 million had been routed through offshore vehicles to a network of consulting firms that did not appear to have done any actual consulting. The trail led eventually to Daniel Voss, the chief operating officer who had laughed loudest at Margaret's joke. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home in Greenwich. The footage of his arrest, in a bathrobe at 6 in the morning with his wife shouting at the agents from the doorway, played on every news network in the country. Imani watched the footage on a muted television in her office. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply made a note in her leather planner, the same kind her mother had once carried, and went back to work. The months that followed moved with a velocity that even Imani had not fully anticipated. By the end of the first quarter under the new board, Haverson Industries had announced the largest internal pay equity adjustment in the company's history. More than 2,000 employees, most of them women and people of color in middle management positions, received salary corrections that ranged from $8,000 a year to $94,000. The total cost to the company was $41 million. The stock, which financial analysts had predicted would tumble on the news, actually rose 3.5% that week, because the institutional investors who had been waiting for genuine reform, finally, had something to point to. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund increased its position by another 2%. 2 of the pension funds that had been on the fence in the original proxy negotiation now wrote public letters of support. The lobby downstairs was renovated in the second quarter. The bronze statue of Cornelius Haverson remained, exactly where it had always been, but the new plaque beside it listed all 18 names. Cornelius at the top, the 17 black laborers beneath him. The plaque also included a paragraph that explained, briefly and honestly, what the historical record had shown about how the company had begun. There had been internal debate about whether to include the explanation or whether to let the names speak for themselves. Imani had been the one who insisted on the paragraph. She had said, in the meeting where the decision was made, that letting the names stand alone without context would allow visitors to look at them and assume they were a list of honored ancestors. The paragraph turned them from a list into a reckoning. Margaret Haverson Pierce attended the unveiling. She had not been invited exactly, but she had not been disinvited either, and she came on her own. She stood at the back of the small crowd in the lobby, wearing a simple gray dress and no jewelry except her wedding ring, and she listened as Imani read each of the 17 names aloud. After the reading, when the small crowd had begun to disperse, Margaret approached Imani for the first time since the day in her office. She did not extend her hand. She had learned that lesson, at least. She simply said quietly that she had spent the last 6 months reading the history her family had buried, and that she was sorry, and that she did not expect to be forgiven, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life trying to understand what she had not been raised to understand. Imani listened. She did not offer absolution. Absolution was not hers to give, and Margaret, to her credit, did not seem to be asking for it. The two women stood together in the lobby for perhaps 3 minutes, and then Margaret nodded once and walked out through the front doors, past the reporters who had stopped staking out her every move months ago, and into the city she no longer ruled. The scholarship program Imani had been quietly running for the descendants of the 17 men was formally adopted by the new Haverson Foundation in the third quarter. The 31 young people Imani had been funding became the first class of what would eventually become a permanent program. By the end of the second year, the program had expanded to include scholarships for descendants of workers at every Haverson facility across the country, going back 5 generations. The program was endowed at $300 million. The largest single donor to the endowment was Margaret Haverson Pierce, who had quietly contributed $112 million from her personal fortune, an amount that represented, Bradford Whitcomb told her dryly, almost everything she had outside of the Haverson Trust itself. Margaret had simply nodded when Bradford explained what she would be left with. She had said very quietly that she had spent her entire life owning things she had not earned, and that she would rather spend the rest of it with less. Nia Brooks did not exist in this story, but Catherine Mills did, the woman who had stared at her notepad during Margaret's joke and said nothing. Catherine reached out to Imani in the second month after the takeover and asked for a meeting. The meeting was not pleasant. Imani did not pretend it was. Catherine had spent 14 years at Haverson, had been promoted 3 times under Margaret's leadership, and had remained silent through dozens of moments she now wanted to describe as moments she had regretted. Imani listened to her without interrupting. When Catherine finished, Imani told her plainly that she did not believe in punishing silence as if it were the same as cruelty, but that she also did not believe in promoting people whose primary qualification for leadership had been knowing when to keep their mouths shut. Catherine was offered a lateral position, a chance to lead the implementation of the new compliance protocols, and a clear path that would require her to become, in the next phase of her career, the kind of executive who actually spoke up. Catherine took the offer. 6 months later, she would testify on the record during the regulatory hearings about Daniel Voss, and her testimony would be the one that closed the last gap in the case against him. Patrice Okonkwo joined Meridian permanently as a partner. Sterling Whittaker, who was supposed to retire in 3 years, quietly told Imani over dinner one evening that he was no longer planning to retire, because he had not realized, until this past year, what the work could look like when it was finally being done at full scale. Devon Ashford was approached by his old contacts at Goldman, with an offer to come back at 3 times his Meridian salary. He laughed for so long on the phone that the recruiter eventually hung up on him. And on the 38th floor of the Meridian building, in the small, quiet hours of an evening that came nearly a year after the day she had walked into the Haverson conference room, Imani Calloway sat alone at her desk and looked out at the city lights stretching to the horizon, and she allowed herself, for the second time since this had all begun, the smallest of smiles. There was still so much work to do. The first anniversary of the takeover arrived on a clear Wednesday morning in October. Imani did not mark the date publicly. There was no press release, no commemorative speech, no carefully staged photograph of her standing in the lobby beside the new plaque. She had decided months earlier that anniversaries belonged to people who needed reminders of who they were, and she had not, she hoped, become that kind of person. Instead, she did what she did every Wednesday morning. She rose at 4:30, ran 6 miles along the river while the sky shifted from black to gray to pale blue, returned to her apartment, drank a cup of coffee, and read for an hour before going to the office. The book she was reading that morning was a thin volume of essays her mother had owned. The spine was cracked. The pages were soft with use. Her mother had underlined passages in a careful pencil hand, and Imani had been working her way through the book slowly for the last several months, treating each underlined sentence as a kind of inheritance. The passage she read that morning had been underlined twice, with a small star drawn in the margin. It said simply that the measure of a life was not what a person had taken from the world, but what the world had been forced to make room for because that person had refused to disappear. Imani closed the book. She finished her coffee. She went to work. The board meeting that afternoon was an ordinary one. The quarterly numbers were strong. The expansion into 3 new community-focused initiatives had been approved without dissent. The new chief operating officer, a 48-year-old engineer named Asha Krishnan, who had been promoted from within after Daniel Voss's arrest, presented an operational review that ran 14 minutes long and contained more substance than any presentation Daniel had ever given in his entire tenure. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the chair, ran the meeting with the kind of crisp efficiency that made the executives who had survived the transition wonder how they had ever tolerated the long, performative ramblings of the old leadership. After the meeting, Imani took the elevator down to the lobby. She did this once a week, always on Wednesdays, always alone. She walked across the marble floor, past the fountain and the bronze statue, and stood for a moment in front of the new plaque. She read the 17 names. She did not read them silently. She moved her lips, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was reading something that mattered, and she said each name out loud, in the order they appeared, the way her mother had said the names of the saints in their kitchen on Sunday mornings. When she finished, she stood quietly for another moment. A young woman in the uniform of the building's cleaning staff was wiping down the brass railing near the elevators. She looked up, saw Imani, and smiled shyly. Imani smiled back. The young woman returned to her work. Imani walked out through the front doors into the bright October afternoon and got into the car where Eugene was waiting for her. "Where to, Dr. Calloway?" "Home, Eugene. The long way. I want to see the river." The car pulled out into the slow afternoon traffic. The city slid past the tinted windows, construction workers and mothers with strollers and old men feeding pigeons. The world doing what the world did, going on, indifferent and beautiful, and full of small rooms where small people made decisions that touched millions of lives. Imani let her head rest back against the seat and watched it all go by. She thought, as she often did at the end of a long week, about the moment the room had laughed at her, about the way Margaret's voice had asked who let her in, about the way her own hand had remained extended across the polished wood of the conference table. She thought about how often in the year that had followed, journalists and commentators had described that moment as the moment everything changed. She did not entirely agree with them. The moment had not changed everything. The moment had only revealed what had already been true, what had already been built, what had already been waiting. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A text from Sterling. The Haverson Foundation had just approved its 10th scholarship class. 104 new students this year, the largest cohort yet. 3 of them were studying business. 2 were studying law. 1 was studying nursing. The rest were spread across engineering and education and the arts and the trades. They came from 26 states. They were the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of people whose names had once been erased. Imani read the message twice. She set the phone down. She watched the river come into view as the car turned onto the parkway, the water catching the afternoon light, the bridges arching across in their slow gray spans. She thought of her mother, who had given her $17,000 and a whispered instruction in a hospital bed. She thought of her father, who had cleaned courthouse floors and taught her chess. She thought of the 17 men whose names she now said out loud every Wednesday. She thought of the small smile she had allowed herself in the elevator that day, the smile of confirmation, and she understood now that the smile had not been about Margaret or the boardroom or the $1 billion. The smile had been about her mother. The smile had been the answer to the question her mother had asked her from the hospital bed. The smile had been her saying, "Yes, Mama, I built it. And when they tried to take it, I let them try." The car crossed the bridge. The river opened out below. Imani Calloway, who 1 year ago had walked into a room where 12 people had laughed at her, sat quietly in the back seat and watched the world go by. There was still so much work to do, and she had time.